Hi, I'm Sara and welcome to Hen Corner. Today we're looking at sourdough and how to make a sourdough starter or a sourdough ferment. Making bread using sourdough, some people think of sour. I've heard of some supermarkets even adding vinegar to their bread to make a sour flavour. But traditional sourdough, real sourdough, is a bread that is made using wild yeasts rather than cultivated yeasts, commercial yeasts. And as a bread maker running a micro bakery here at Hen Corner, we do use fresh yeast when we're making bread. We do use dried yeast sometimes when we're making bread. But our most popular bread is made with sourdough starter. And sourdough is where you cultivate your own yeast from the wild yeasts around us, and we use that to create a lovely bubbly environment where the yeast can get growing really nicely. It can start to ferment, producing lots of bubbles, and then as you use that within your bread dough, then the yeast will continue to ferment while the dough is resting, creating lots of lovely big bubbles in your bread, meaning you can have a lovely chewy, flavoursome loaf of bread. Makes perfect toast. It really is a special bread, but there's something special about it in as much as well as being good for you and good for your gut health because it's fermented, and nice and natural because you're using wild yeast rather than buying extra ingredients from the shop. It does need a lot of TLC, a bit of TLC, and it takes about a week to get going when you're making a sourdough starter before you can actually start making your loaf of bread. So it's quite a lengthy process. But once you've done the process that we're going to be talking about today, then you've got a sourdough ferment that you can use for years and years to come. So my current ferment that I am working with every single week, it's been in my fridge now for about 5 or 6 years, and it's those same initial wild yeast that we captured and we cultivated all that time ago, and it's still making great bread today. So let me explain how you do it. There is wild yeast, there is yeast all around us, in the air, on surfaces, on fruits growing on the trees. There's yeast on grains that are grown by the farmers. So when you buy flour that's milled grain, there will be yeasts in here already. Now, the technique I'm showing you today is simply flour and water, because we want to cultivate the yeast that are in this flour, and we want to cultivate those to work within our bread. Whereas I have heard of other recipes that tell you to put in banana skins and fruit skins and pineapple juice and run around the garden collecting wild yeasts that are growing on your trees and scraping it in. I've heard of all different kinds of suggestions, but I am confident that you've got some good yeast in your flour, and all we need to do is to hydrate this flour, add some water to it, wake up any of the yeast that are dry. The dry yeast, as it wakes up with the water, will start, or to put it in simple terms, munching on the carbohydrate, on the flour, and then burping out gas, carbon dioxide, from the carbohydrate from the flour it's been eating, that it's got access to. So very simply, all you need to do is take a container. I tend to do it in a jam jar. If you've ever been here on a sourdough course, you'll have seen that I have jam jars all lined up with day 1, day 2, all the way through to day 7. So to start off, your sourdough starter, or sourdough ferment, you take a clean jam jar and you put in a couple of spoons of flour. Now, that's dried flour. Nothing's going to happen to that if it's kept dry. But as soon as you top it up with a bit of water, probably the first day it'll be equal quantities of flour and water, mix it together. So probably about a tablespoon of each the first day. Now this is about the science of it. It's not about the maths of it. You don't need to weigh it out. You don't need to worry about, oh, there was an extra half a teaspoon, will it work? So mixing together the flour and the water into a thickish paste, and that's all you do. And you put a lid on it and you put it on the side, kitchen counter, for a day, for 24 hours. Now you want it sealed because you don't want it to dry out. You don't want a crust forming. You don't want it, you want it to stay airtight so that the yeast can do its thing. It can access the oxygen that's in the jar there, and you've got, it's got all the goodies that it can feed on in that wet flour solution. You leave that for 1 day. You might notice when you come back to it the next day, there's a couple of bubbles in it. That's absolutely fine. That's what we would expect. The next day, you take the lid off and you put in another spoon of flour and you mix that together. Now, if that's a bit too dry, you might need to put a bit more water. You won't need to put as much water in, because when the yeast is fermenting with your flour and water solution, it will naturally produce carbon dioxide in the bubbles, but there also will be a release of water in the process as well. So you might find that it's quite wet and it doesn't need any more water. But if it does, you can just put a splash more water in, mix it together, and then leave it with the lid on top, nicely sealed, on your worktop for 24 hours. And you repeat this process every day. You add some flour, and you'll notice every day when you come to it that it will have changed slightly. Obviously, it'll increase in volume. You'll notice there's bubbles. And when you open it, smell it, and it will smell different every single day. And some days it will smell like vinegar, some days it will smell like sick, some days it will smell quite sweet. It will be different every day over the course of the 7 days. And the reason that it's different every day, and the reason that we take it through a 7-week process, is because there's a whole variety of yeasts that are in the air, on the flour, and we want to cultivate the dominant yeast. We want to work out which is the yeast that is going to be the strong yeast that's going to give us consistently good bread. So the first day, it might be, oh, I like this, I'm very happy, look at me, I'm the yeast that's doing its thing. And then it might be quite short-lived and it lost its puff, dropped down, and then the second day it's a different yeast going, I'm starting to wake up now, I like this, thank you very much. And then the third day another one goes, well, I was just enjoying that from my snooze, but now I'm really going for it. And it takes this 7-day period for the different yeast to go up and down and munching on the carbohydrate, getting fed, doing its thing, burping out some carbon dioxide bubbles, until by the 7th day the champion yeast, the dominant yeast, the main yeast is the one that is going to be leading the way in your fermentation jar. So I'm going to now show you one that we've been working on over the course of a week. This is my jar that I like to make sourdough ferment in. Now I say like to make it, I actually only make this for demonstrations, for films like this and for my courses, because I don't need to make this again. I don't need to spend a whole week making sourdough to make my bread, because I keep my original one in the fridge, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. So I don't know if you can see, there's a whole load of bubbles here. This is where this has been fermenting. Really, really happy, and I've got some lively yeast that has been cultivated here just in flour and water. So if I take the lid off, what does it smell like? Bit boozy, bit alcoholic, hint of nail varnish remover. It will be fine, because this has been fermenting overnight and we need to add more flour and water to it. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to pour this, in fact, if I pop this on here, then you'll see maybe a bit better. So I'm going to pour this into a bigger bowl now, because we've now cultivated our yeast. This has taken 7 days to do. We're now going to use this to make a firm ferment, and a firm ferment is much more stable, much easier to work with than a bubbly jar of something that overflows on the kitchen work surface or bubbles out into your fridge and gets caught up in your pastrami or whatever. We want something that's nice and firm and easy to work with, easy to break off pieces, easy to weigh, easy to use as an addition to your final dough. So this is not your dough, this is your ferment. You're using this instead of yeast. Well, it is yeast, but instead of a recipe that will say put in a teaspoon of powdered yeast or put in 20 grams of fresh yeast, you're going to be putting in your yeast, which is in your sourdough ferment. So you can see, ooh, that we've got quite a gooey consistency. Look at that. Look at that. You can see how it's stretching. You can see how the fermentation has also started to activate, to develop some of the gluten. It's quite sloppy, but it's also quite thick, and there's bubbles throughout. So I'm going to empty this jar into my mixing bowl. Okay, we'll get the last bits out. Okay, now that's very runny, and I know that some people do keep their ferments quite runny, but I like a nice firm ferment. So what I'm going to do, I am going to add on double flour to water. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to put 200 grams of flour. I've got weighing scales here in front of me. Ooh, a little bit more. 200 grams of flour, and then I want 100 grams of water. And then I'm going to mix it. Now, double flour to water is a very thick dough. We've obviously got some liquid in there because of the sourdough ferment, but it's much thicker than a normal bread dough. We're not having to work this, we're not having to knead this, we're not going to be, you know, this is not our bread, this is not our bread dough, this is our ferment. This is our little house of yeast where we can break off the bits that we need when we are making our bread. So I'm actually going to get my hands in there now to make sure that I'm mixing the flour and the water evenly. Now, because the ferment was quite soft when it went in, the sourdough out of the jar was quite soft, this dough is softer than it would be in the future when you continue adding your double flour to water. So at the moment it is quite soft and does feel a bit more like a bread dough. But this is still the first stages. You're making the ferment. This is not making sourdough bread, this is making sourdough ferment so that you can incorporate yeast into your sourdough bread. So we've got there the firm dough, and we now need to leave that to ferment further. So I want that sealed. In the jam jar we had a lid, on the jam jar we had a lid. With this bowl we're going to have a shower cap. That's a little trick that all us bread angels use, it's brilliant. So that in the bowl with a shower cap on top, leave that on the side at room temperature for about 4 hours, and you'll find that it will grow as the yeast is continuing to ferment, and it's delighted that you've given it all that flour to feast on, and then once, and you'll feel the consistency, you'll feel as you pull a bit off, you'll see the bubbles, you'll see that it's a lot lighter, and then this is what you add into your bread dough. Only a bit, probably only about 100 grams of sourdough ferment into your bread dough. So if you're making a loaf of sourdough bread, say for example you're using 1 kilo of flour, we will always use 2% of salt with our flour. So 2% of a kilo is 20 grams of salt. So 1 kilo of flour, 20 grams of salt. And then water, we would use 72% hydration. So that's 720 grams of water. And then you put 200 grams of the sourdough ferment into your dough mix, and then that is the dough that you use to make your bread. Now, I'd put 200 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, so I added 300 to this, plus the original ferment that was in the jar. So I'm only going to use a fraction of this in my bread dough. I'm still going to have some of this left. So I've made my bread dough, I've taken the 200 grams out, put it to my kilo of flour, put it to my 720 grams of water, my 20 grams of yeast, 20 grams of salt. That's my bread dough to make 2 lovely big loaves of bread. But this, what's left in here, I will then add more flour and water, double flour to water. Knead it into a bit of a dough like this. And then what I'll do, because I'm not going to make bread for a while because I've just making 2 nice big loaves of sourdough now, I will put that in the fridge. Now I've got a nice square Tupperware container, nice sturdy seal on it, and I pop that into my Tupperware container and I keep it in the fridge. And it's fine there for a week, it's fine there for 2 weeks. This is where I would say I have heard of sourdough hotels where people pay for someone to look after their sourdough starter and to feed it every day. It doesn't need feeding every day. If it's in the fridge, it all slows down. Fridge puts everything on pause. So put it in the fridge, it slows it down. And then when you want to use it another time, next time you want to make sourdough bread, you take it out of the freezer the day before, out of the fridge, forget the freezer, take it out of the fridge the day before you want to bake your bread. And you add double flour to water, so it could be 200 grams of flour to 100 grams of water. I tend to bake in bigger batches, so I'm putting in 400 grams of flour to 200 of water. Mix it into a dough in a bowl, shower cap on, 4 hours, and then it's ready to start making your dough. So that's why the bit that's left over goes back into the fridge, and it can stay there and being added to every time you use it, and it can serve you faithfully for many, many years. I think there's a story once, oh, that's the oven going, I've got a loaf of bread in the oven. So there's a story once where I heard, I think it's Italian brides get given sourdough ferment from their mother-in-laws as a wedding present. That might not be true, it might just be a story that I've heard. Anyway, I hope that's given you some help. I will put some instructions down in the comments box, in the description. Let me know how you get on, and if you make some good bread, post some pictures, tag in Hen Corner. We would love to see how it goes. I hope this helped you. Do subscribe to the channel, follow us on all our social media, Hen Corner, and our blog, www.hencorner.com. I need to go get that bread out of the oven. See you soon. Join us on the journey.